terrible and at the same time thrilling. But at the zenith of their power, monarchs often chose their own relatives as wives. When the grandson prince of a duke faced the choice of a bride, a graceful young lady could turn out to be his cousin or even his aunt, and this was considered not only acceptable, but noble. In the royal world of European dynasties of past centuries, marriage regulations were built not on love and personal sympathies, but on political calculations and the desire to preserve the purity of the blood. The Habsburg houses, for example, became famous for their genetic chains. A protruding lower jaw and a tendency to epilepsy were passed down from generation to generation as a reward for loyalty to the dynasty. Such unions strengthened political alliances between lands, but invisibly paved the way to disaster. With each marriage between close relatives, the likelihood of recessive genes manifesting, carrying severe developmental defects, mental disorders, and physical deformities, increased. Even in nature, animals and birds instinctively avoided close inbreeding, yet European royal houses turned a deadly biological threat into state policy. This was not merely curiosity or a reason for court mockery. It was a chronicle of genetic degradation. Princes were born with severe physiological anomalies that skewed their gaze and distorted their limbs, often suffering seizures and episodes of mental deficiency. In the atmosphere of palace intrigues, genealogies twisted like tree branches and closed in on themselves, denying fresh blood and new genetic combinations. As a result, great empires lost the ability to rule effectively. Kings were physically or mentally incapable of performing their duties, inevitably plunging their subjects into chaos and internecine strife. Geneticists today call this phenomenon inbreeding depression, when accumulated harmful mutations emerge from the shadows and begin to govern the fate of entire dynasties. To understand why this was so destructive, it is enough to recall that with each generation of blood relation, the chances of a defective gene appearing doubled, and if marriages between cousins or closer relatives occurred for several generations in a row, the number of loaded bullets in the genetic roulette became catastrophically high. Each such union for land, title, or alliance agreement led to an heir who, at best, was born sickly and weak, and at worst, did not live a day. The consequences were felt not only within palace halls, dynasties lost authority and peoples lost stability. Today we can see this in colorful museum exhibits and ancient chronicles, where courtly dances are replaced by descriptions of the terrible ailments of crowned blood princes. These stories are not from fairy tales about beautiful princesses and brave knights, but from a dark chapter of real medieval and early modern history, where the fates of entire peoples were decided in intellectual chambers and ceremonial rooms at the cost of an invisible but merciless enemy, their own genetic code. In a world where maintaining a pure dynastic line was above common sense, the result was monarchs entangled in their own family ties and weak to the point of incapacity, as if crowns sank under the weight of a cursed legacy. If you appreciate such calm stories about history, please subscribe to the channel. It's free and helps me continue. Many found it incredible that consanguineous marriages in royal dynasties turned into their silent sentence. As a result, geneticists called the decline in viability due to close-kin marriages a collapse of biological resilience. The population lost its vitality. Monarchs themselves created increasingly less viable heirs with each generation. However, the practice of consanguineous unions was not limited to European courts. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs married brothers and sisters in the name of divine origin, and in the Inca Empire, kinship unions were considered a way to strengthen power and guarantee loyalty. Few houses left such detailed evidence of tragic consequences as the great branches of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain and Austria. The most vivid and grim example was the story of the Spanish Habsburg line, which told of the infamous prognathism, a pronounced protrusion of the lower jaw, one of the most characteristic manifestations of the Habsburg jaw. In 1661, King Charles II of Spain was born, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, whose genealogy by that time formally counted 16 ancestors, but in reality, only 7 distinct individuals due to repeated close kin marriages. The coefficient of kinship between his parents was higher than that of a brother and sister marriage. The result was a monarch with numerous physical and mental abnormalities, a prominent lower jaw and excessively large tongue, making speaking and chewing nearly impossible. He did not learn to walk until the age of 8, and his mental development never surpassed that of a small child. Physicians of the time were skeptical about his capacity for intimate relations, and despite 2 marriages, he left no offspring. When he turned 38, an autopsy revealed chronic deformities of internal organs, 1 blackened ovary, displaced tissues, and a heart the size of a peppercorn. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs fell not to external enemies, but to their own genetic trap. But this is only one page of genetic tragedy. In Russia, the Romanov dynasty also practiced consanguineous unions, and hemophilia, inherited by Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, the only son of the last Russian emperor Nicholas II, only worsened the series of misfortunes that led to the empire's end and fundamental changes in the country's fate. The slightest scratch could prove fatal. It seemed that the very blood influenced the course of history. The hemophilia of Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov, the only son of the last Russian emperor Nicholas II, was described as a hereditary ailment nicknamed the royal disease. It was passed down through the descendants of Queen Victoria of Great Britain due to countless dynastic marriages aimed at strengthening political alliances. This blood-clotting disorder, linked to a mutation of factor VIII, caused internal bleeding even from the slightest injuries, and the pain during these episodes was so unbearable that his cries echoed beyond the thick walls of the Winter Palace. Each attack threatened joint swelling and life-threatening conditions, prompting his parents to desperately seek a cure. They turned to Grigory Rasputin, who seemed able to stop the bleeding with prayers and mystical rituals. Each attack threatened joint swelling and a life-threatening condition, prompting the parents to desperately seek healing. They turned to Grigory Rasputin, who seemed capable of stopping the bleeding with prayers and mystical rituals. However, the growing closeness of the elder to the imperial couple sparked rumors of court debauchery and intensified popular discontent, ultimately undermining the monarchy's authority and accelerating the fall of the 3-century-old Romanov dynasty in 1917. Meanwhile, other European royal houses noted manifestations of genetic defects. The Spanish king Alfonso XIII, through his marriage to Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, also experienced episodes of severe bleeding that negated the convulsive attempts at dynastic alliances. Alongside physical ailments, hereditary mental instability also surfaced in royal genes. The most vivid example remained King George III of Britain, whose episodes of severe psychosis, during which he exhausted himself with endless conversations, sometimes foamed at the mouth and required physical restraint, terrified courtiers. Historians propose theories of porphyria, a genetic disease with neurological symptoms and characteristic dark red urine, or bipolar disorder, and modern studies confirm that multiple marriages within the British royal family and close ties with other dynasties only increase the risks of such ailments. Joanna, the Mad of Castile, Ludwig II of Bavaria, nicknamed the Mad King, and some Portuguese monarchs exhibited similar signs of mental instability, leading contemporaries to speak of a royal blood curse. Naturally, not all cases of mental disorders at court were directly linked to consanguineous marriages. Monarchs' conditions were also affected by political intrigues, endless obligations, and sometimes heavy metal poisoning during medical procedures. Nevertheless, the concentration of both physical and mental pathologies in families with a high degree of genetic closeness could hardly be considered coincidental. The legacy of European imperial and royal houses included not only tragic pages of rule, but also recognizable features: the famous Habsburg jaw, asymmetrical facial contours, short stature, and stooping posture, resulting from centuries of dynastic marriages where politics outweighed genetic safety. What monarch could rule without the ability to eat properly? Imagine a king whose lower jaw protruded so far forward that he could not clearly pronounce a single word. And this was just one of the terrible hereditary ailments of the Habsburg dynasty. Artistic portraits, even the most flattering, could not conceal the deeply rooted prognathism clearly visible on the face of Philip IV of Spain. His lower lip protruded so unnaturally that it seemed almost separate from the rest of his face. In 1593, Ferdinand I, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, was born with hydrocephalus, which led to excessive fluid accumulation in the brain and made the shape of his head extraordinarily disproportionate. Many representatives of closely interbred branches of royal houses suffered from dwarfism or, conversely, disproportionately long limbs and an exaggeratedly large skull. The most indicative example is perhaps Charles II of Spain, whose fate entered the annals of chroniclers as the embodiment of cosmetic and functional deformities: a large head on a fragile body, a clearly inherited genetic defect of the nasal passage, naturally constantly congested, and excessively thick lips covered with endless mucus. His jaw was so deformed that his upper and lower teeth did not meet, and eating became a painful ritual, increasing the ranks of servants always ready to feed him with a spoon. These distortions were not limited to appearance. Kings struggled to speak, often developed neurological disorders, and the extent of their rule depended not only on political intrigues, but also on the whims of their speech and digestive organs. The purity of royal blood came at the cost of infertility. Many dynasties died out without producing heirs. For example, Anne of Austria and Louis XIII of France, being first cousins, waited in vain for 23 years for an heir, and only the birth of Louis XIV became a true miracle, arousing doubts among contemporaries and confirmed by modern geneticists as diagnoses of low fertility linked to recessive mutations. Queen Anne of the House of Stuart, the last monarch of Great Britain, had 17 pregnancies in her lifetime, but only 5 children were born alive, and none survived childhood, which fully aligns with typical manifestations of close inbreeding. These heartbreaking family tragedies turned into national crises. The death of Charles II without heirs was one of the causes of the War of the Spanish Succession, which claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and, by the Treaty of Utrecht, reshaped the political map of Europe, showing that even the greatness of royal houses cannot circumvent the laws of nature. How could royal roots turn into poison for the dynasty itself? It turned out that excessive concern for pure blood led some royal families to literally exhaust their genetic pool and lose the ability to produce offspring. It happened like this. Families striving to keep power and property within a narrow circle preferred unions with first or second-degree relatives. Instead of recognizing the danger, many monarchic houses responded to the first signs of genetic failures by further closing ranks within the clan, which only intensified the vicious circle of hereditary diseases. The Habsburgs were the most striking example. Their Spanish branch, facing fertility problems, decided to seek spouses in the Austrian line of the same family, further narrowing the genetic pool. This paradoxical strategy accelerated the deterioration of the dynasty's health and ultimately led to the degeneration of the line. By the 17th century, many court physicians already suspected the connection between consanguineous marriages and dynastic ailments, but the calculation of court advisors and political advantage outweighed biological common sense. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church officially prohibited marriages between blood relatives without special papal dispensations, yet royal houses were granted dispensations with astonishing ease, while ordinary people would have been refused even for the same degree of kinship. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church officially prohibited marriages between close blood relatives without special papal dispensations. However, for royal houses, dispensations were granted with astonishing ease, whereas ordinary people would have been denied even for the same degree of kinship. This double standard indicated that the spiritual authorities understood the risks but made concessions to maintain political alliances. Meanwhile, few dynasties found ways to refresh their gene pool. For example, the modern British royal family in recent centuries more often married members of unrelated aristocratic families and even commoners, thereby avoiding the extremes of inbreeding. But for those who did not dare to make such changes, the consequences were catastrophic. The most striking example in this regard was the fate of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun. Applied genetic studies of the mummy, discovered by Howard Carter in 1920, showed that the young ruler was the product of a brother-sister marriage, a common practice in the dynasty of ancient Egypt. Scientists identified numerous genetic pathologies in him: a deformed jaw, a severe form of bone disease, possibly epilepsy, as well as a severe immune disorder. In his burial chamber, 130 crutches were found, confirming problems with walking and a congenital foot deformity. With a serious leg injury and malaria infection, his weakened body could not withstand, and the pharaoh died at about 19 years old, leaving no heirs, thus ending the dynastic line. This case is one of the few historical examples where physical remains provide direct evidence of the harmful consequences of extreme endogamy, preserved for more than 3,000 years. It is remarkable that behind the glittering crowns and luxurious attire were hidden not only secrets of power, but also terrible traces of incest, imprinted in the very bones of rulers. Historians noted that genetic diseases deeply influence monarchs' ability to make decisions and largely determine the course of history. For instance, Ferdinand I, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire from the Habsburg dynasty, suffered from hydrocephalus and epilepsy, inherited as a result of centuries of inbreeding within the family. According to contemporaries, he uttered the phrase, "I am emperor and I need steamed dumplings," when advisors tried to take over state affairs, emphasizing the limitations of his mental and physical powers. During his reign in 1563, the Austro-Hungarian heritage was effectively governed by a regency council headed by Archduchess Maria and Cardinal Johann, which ultimately shifted the balance of power in Central Europe and laid the groundwork for future conflicts with the Ottoman Empire. In the House of Bourbon, Louis XVI inherited from his ancestors a tendency to obesity, and according to some doctors of the time, suffered from phimosis, which made intimate relations painful. This complication, together with a duet of political intrigues and gossip, delayed the birth of an heir and fueled rumors of the king's infertility and Marie Antoinette's infidelity. As a result, even before the French Revolution, the monarchy's authority weakened when court wives spoke of the powerless king and the unfaithful queen. Nicholas II, the last Russian emperor, found himself in a difficult position during the First World War and the crisis of February 1917. Nicholas II, the last Russian emperor, found himself in a difficult position during the First World War and the crisis of February 1917. Constantly concerned about the health of his son, Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia, he increasingly delegated power to his wife, Grand Duchess Alexandra Feodorovna, and the healer Grigory Rasputin. This distraction with family problems at a critical moment prevented Nicholas from effectively implementing reforms and mobilizing public support, which accelerated the collapse of the Russian Empire. It remains shocking that decisions affecting the lives of millions, from the start of the war to government council resolutions, often came from people whose mental or physical abilities were seriously weakened by genetic defects. Meanwhile, propaganda persistently created the image of monarchs as beings of divine origin. Court painters in the 1660s erased traces of defects in portraits of Charles II of Spain, depicting him as slender and attentive, while in public appearances he was carefully hidden behind screens and seated next to a trusted advisor, and signatures on official documents were made with a seal instead of a trembling hand. Such a gulf between the throne's radiance and the fragility of its inhabitants became one of the reasons why people increasingly doubted the divine right to rule, and the monarchies of Europe, dragging entire continents with them, ultimately lost their inviolability. Who would have thought that the most majestic royal dynasties of Europe were slowly dying from their own concern for pure blood? This discrepancy between the brilliant appearance and painful reality was not merely a matter of court vanity, but an existential political necessity. The legitimacy of absolutist monarchies was based on the notion of the divine origin of kings and their unquestionable superiority over subjects. How could such a rigid class system be justified if someone admitted that members of royal families, following centuries-old marital traditions, were actually undermining their own genetic health? It was impressive that millions of people for centuries endured the rule of dynasties that, from a biological point of view, were doomed to internal degeneration. Propaganda, church rituals, and the spears of a professional army reliably preserved this illusion for as long as logic or empirical data allowed. Only in the second half of the 19th century did the obvious become undeniable. Surviving royal houses were forced to seek marital partners far beyond the narrow circle of cousins to halt the increase of hereditary diseases and childlessness in the most noble families. This dynastic genetic revolution coincided with political changes when absolute monarchy gradually transformed into constitutional monarchy, and the monarch's power was limited by parliament and the legislative framework. It is no coincidence that the British Crown, most far-sightedly admitting new allies from various aristocratic families and foreigners into its dynasty, proved better prepared for the challenges of the new century, while the stubbornly preserved customs of marrying close relatives by the Habsburgs and their Spanish allies soon faded irreversibly. Ironically, the most meticulous genealogical registers kept by monarchs to confirm their unblemished lineage turned out to be invaluable material for the first geneticists. Their statistical summaries and kinship charts made it possible to identify the mechanisms of accumulation of recessive mutations, which were the cause of many hereditary diseases in isolated populations. Today, this data serves as the foundation for modern population medicine and helps not only to predict, but also to prevent severe genetic disorders. Thus, deep within golden halls and beneath the cry of triumphant fanfares lay a tragedy softened neither by luxurious garments nor sparkling crowns. Those who considered themselves too noble to interbreed with commoners paid the highest biological price: the disappearance of their own branches from the family tree. The next time you hear about blue blood and glorious genealogies in a historical film about royal intrigues, remember the dark side of this purity, which cost princes and princesses their health and future. Few suspected that true evolutionary strength often lay hidden in unassuming peasant families. He felt gratitude that his ancestors were simple peasants who did not have to worry about diluting royal blood when choosing spouses. In medieval Europe, hereditary monarchs and aristocrats often married within a narrow circle of cousins, seeking to preserve influence and wealth, but such unions led to the accumulation of genetic defects and weakened the health of their heirs. Meanwhile, peasants formed unions with neighbors from different villages, exchanging harvests, crafts, and customs, which promoted blood diversity and the survival of the community during epidemics and famines. Often, the true advantage lay in being ordinary enough to avoid the traps of false grandeur and to preserve the natural resilience of the lineage, even in the harshest times.